Mr. President, let me take this opportunity to thank my colleagues on the Defense Committee for their hard work in presenting this bill, but I am going to cast a very strong no vote on this legislation. And this morning I want to say a few words about why I am voting no, to talk about the number of amendments that I have offered to this bill, and to express my very serious concerns about our nation's bloated military budget, particularly in light of the many unmet needs we face as a nation. Also, I must express a very serious objection to the fact that we are dealing with a $716 billion piece of legislation that is more than half of the discretionary budget, and yet we will, in all likelihood, not have a process which allows for amendments to be debated. $716 billion at a time when in Louisiana, as I understand it, they're now going to be cutting food stamps for hungry children, where schools throughout this country don't have enough money for books or for teachers' salaries. We're talking about a $716 billion military budget, and this process, as I understand it, will allow for no amendments, despite the fact that I think virtually every member of the Senate has concerns about this bill. You know, Mr. President, over and over again, I have heard my Republican colleagues and a number of Democratic colleagues come to the floor and talk about a very serious issue, and that is the $21 trillion national debt that we are leaving our kids and our grandchildren. But somehow, when it comes to giving huge tax breaks, $1 trillion in tax breaks to the top 1%, suddenly we don't hear much about that national debt. And when it comes to spending $716 billion on a defense bill, my Republican friends are mute. Suddenly, the debt has disappeared because it's okay to spend unlimited sums of money on the military. Mr. President, I have heard my Republican colleagues tell us that the United States just cannot afford to join the rest of the industrialized world, every other major country, and guarantee health care to all of our people as a right through a Medicare for All program. It's what the American people want, but I'm told we cannot afford that. $716 billion in 1 year for the military we can afford, but health care for our children and for our working people and for the 30 million people who have no health insurance and the tens of millions of people who cannot afford health insurance, that we cannot afford. Mr. President, at the moment that we are engaged in a highly competitive global economy, I am told over and over again that we cannot afford to make public colleges and universities tuition-free. Hundreds of thousands of our young people are unable to go to college because their families lack the income. Millions leave school deeply in debt. Oh, no, we cannot afford to make public colleges and universities tuition-free, but we can afford to spend $716 billion in 1 year on the military. Mr. President, over half of older Americans have no retirement savings. No retirement savings. And yet I got Republican colleagues in the House and here in the Senate who say, oh, we can't afford Social Security. We got to cut Social Security for people who are trying to get by on $12,000, $13,000, $14,000 a year, cutting their prescription drugs in half. Cut Social Security, yes, but think about dealing with a $716 billion military budget in a rational way. No, no, no. We can't afford to do that. We can't even accept amendments here on the floor. Mr. President, the time is long overdue for us to take a hard look at the enormous amount of waste, at the cost overruns, at the fraud, and at the financial mismanagement that has plagued the Department of Defense for decades. I've heard many of my Republican colleagues worried about that low-income people are taking advantage of this program or that program. Well, you know where the money is? The money is at the Department of Defense, and it may be time that we took a hard look at the fraud and the financial mismanagement that exists there. And that is why I am offering a bipartisan amendment. And I want to thank Senators Grassley and Lee for their support on this amendment to end the absurdity of the Department of Defense being the only federal agency that has not undergone an audit. Mr. President, it will not surprise you to note that according to a Gallup poll in February, a few months ago, 65% of the American people oppose spending more money on the Department of Defense. 65% say we should not spend more money, and yet over a 2-year period, we're going to spend some $165 billion more on the defense. So it shouldn't shock anybody that what happens here is in direct contradiction to what the American people want. American people want health care for all. My Republican colleagues want to throw 30 million people off of health insurance. The American people want to ask the rich and powerful to pay more in taxes. My Republican colleagues give massive tax breaks to the top 1%. So in defense spending, it's just the same thing. American people say, I can't afford to send my kid to college. I can't afford childcare. I can't afford housing. We need help there. But nobody listens to that. We don't have lobbyists here fighting for working families so they can find affordable housing or affordable prescription drugs. But today, we're listening to the military-industrial complex and talking about a $165 billion increase in 2 years for the military. Mr. President, as a point in comparison, and I hope everybody hears this, the increase in military spending, $165 billion over 2 years, that we recently approved, is larger than the entire military budget of China. China spends about $150 billion a year on defense. We have increased military spending by $165 billion over 2 years, as well as Russia, which spends about $61 billion on defense annually. So, children in Louisiana may be losing their food stamps and go hungry, but we are spending today voting on a bill of $716 billion at a time when Russia spends about $61 billion on defense. There are enormous needs in this country, in Vermont, in California, all across this country. We might want to listen to the needs of working people rather than just lobbyists from the military-industrial complex. Mr. President, I believe in a strong national defense, but we cannot continue to give the Pentagon and defense contractors like Lockheed Martin a blank check while we ignore the basic needs of working families throughout this country. What this debate should be about, and unfortunately it will not be about, is our national priorities. Do we have to spend more money on defense than the next 10 countries combined when children in America go hungry, when veterans sleep out on the street, when we are the only major country that does not guarantee health care to all people? I say no. And I say that the time is long overdue for us to stand up to the lobbyists and the military-industrial complex and fight for rational national priorities. Mr. President, about half of the Pentagon's $716 billion budget goes directly into the hands of private contractors, not into the hands of our troops. And let's be clear, over the past 2 decades, virtually every major defense contractor in the United States has paid millions of dollars in fines and settlements for misconduct and fraud, all at the same time, while making huge profits on government contracts. Since 1995, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and United Technologies have paid nearly $3 billion in fines or related settlements for fraud or misconduct. $3 billion at a time when oversight, frankly, is pretty weak. Yet those 3 companies alone received about $800 billion in defense contracts over the past 18 years. One of the amendments I have filed would simply require the Pentagon to establish a website on defense contract fraud with a list of companies convicted of defrauding the federal government, the total value of contracts awarded to such companies, and a list of recommendations for ways the Pentagon can penalize fraudulent contractors. My guess is that fraud is a way of doing business, and these settlements are simply a cost of doing business for companies who have huge contracts with the Department of Defense, and that has got to stop. Further, Mr. President, I find it interesting that the very same defense contractors that have been found guilty or reached settlements for fraud are also paying their CEOs and executives excessive and obscene compensation packages. Last year, the CEOs of Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, 2 of the top 4 U.S. defense contractors, were each paid over $20 million in total compensation. Moreover, more than 90% of the revenue from those companies came from defense spending. So they get the bulk of their money comes from the taxpayers of the United States, and then they pay their CEOs exorbitant compensation packages. I think the American people might like to know why a defense contractor can pay its CEO 100 times more than the Secretary of Defense, whose salary is capped at $205,000. To my mind, that is a reasonable question. How does the CEO of a defense contractor get 100 times more salary than the Secretary of Defense? And that is why, Mr. President, I have filed an amendment to prohibit defense contractor CEOs from making more money than the Secretary of Defense. Moreover, Mr. President, as the GAO has told us, there are massive cost overruns in the Defense Department's acquisition budget that we have got to address. According to the GAO, the Pentagon's $1.66 trillion acquisition portfolio currently suffers from more than $537 billion in cost overruns, with much of the cost growth taking place after production. You know, I was a mayor of the city of Burlington, Vermont, for 8 years, and like other mayors throughout this country, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, whatever, you sit down and you negotiate a contract with somebody who perhaps is going to repave the streets. Contractor says, I'm going to do it for $5 million. You sign a contract. And you don't accept the fact that the contractor comes back and says, oh, I'm sorry, we made a little mistake. It's going to cost your people $10 million. Not the way it was done in Burlington, not the way it is done in cities and states throughout this country. But apparently, that is the way it is done at the Department of Defense. Oh, yes, Mr. Secretary, we're going to do this weapon system for $5 billion. Oh, we made a little mistake. You'll have to pay us $10 billion. No problem, no worry. Nobody in Congress is going to raise any issue about that. Mr. President, GAO tells us that, quote, many DoD programs fall short of cost, schedule, and performance expectations, meaning DoD pays more than anticipated, can buy less than expected, and in some cases delivers less capability to the war fighter. End of quote. That is not Bernie Sanders, that's the GAO. Mr. President, let me repeat, a major reason why there is so much waste, fraud, and abuse at the Pentagon is the fact that the department of Defense remains the only federal agency in America that hasn't been able to pass an independent audit 28 years after Congress required it to do so. Now, I know the federal bureaucracy moves slowly, but 28 years should be enough time for the DOD to do what Congress demanded that it do. And the amendment that Senators Grassley, Senator Lee, and I have filed simply says, couldn't be simpler, that if the Pentagon can't pass a clean audit by fiscal year 2022, not tomorrow, fiscal year 2022, then a small portion of the defense budget, about $100 million, will be redirected to deficit reduction. Interestingly, very interestingly, Mr. President, you may recall, on September 10th, 2001, one day before 9/11, former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said, and I quote, this is Donald Rumsfeld, George W. Bush's Secretary of Defense, one day before 9/11. He said, and I quote, our financial systems are decades old. This is the Secretary of Defense, 2001. Our financial systems are decades old. According to some estimates, we cannot track 2.3 trillion in transactions. We cannot share information from floor to floor in this building, Pentagon, because it's stored on dozens of technological systems that are inaccessible or incompatible, end of quote. Donald Rumsfeld, 2001, George Bush's Secretary of Defense, saying that then DOD could not track $2.3 trillion in transactions. And yet, 17 years after Mr. Rumsfeld's comments, the Department of Defense has still not passed a clean audit, despite the fact that the Pentagon controls assets in excess of $2.2 trillion, or roughly 70% of what the entire federal government owns. Mr. President, the Commission on Wartime Contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan concluded in 2011 that $31 to $60 billion spent in Iraq and Afghanistan had been lost to fraud and waste. Children in America go hungry. Young people leave school deeply in debt. People in this country cannot afford health care. $31 to $60 billion in Iraq and Afghanistan have been lost to fraud and waste. Maybe, just maybe, we might want to get our priorities right and take a look at that issue. Separately, in 2015, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction reported that the Pentagon could not account for $45 billion in funding for reconstruction projects. And more recently, an audit conducted by Ernst & Young for the Defense Logistics Agency found that it could not properly account for some $800 million in construction projects. Mr. President, it is time to hold the Department of Defense to the same level of accountability as the rest of the government. Mr. President, I would also like to briefly mention an amendment that, to me, makes an enormous amount of sense. In this bill, we are spending $716 billion in defense spending in order to protect the American people. And what this bill does is spend that money for the production of fighter planes, for bombs, for guns, for missiles, for tanks, for nuclear weapons, for submarines, and other weapons of destruction. The amendment that I have submitted would reduce the defense budget by 0.1%, not a massive cut, 0.1%. And we would use that $700 million, 0.1% of the current budget, to make our country safer by reaching out to people throughout the world in ways that bring us together through educational and cultural programs. At the end of the day, it is not necessarily true that guns and tanks and missiles are the only way that we will be safe. We will be safer when people throughout the world get to know each other, understand the common humanity that they have. When kids from Iran and Burlington, Vermont can sit down and talk about the issues that they face. So, Mr. President, what this amendment is about is helping to make us safer by investing in educational programs, allowing our kids to go abroad to learn about other countries, allowing kids from other countries to come into the United States. Dialogue alone taking place between foreign ministers or diplomats at the United Nations is not the only way that countries can relate to each other. That type of dialogue, that type of communication, that type of sharing of who we are should be taking place between people throughout the world at the grassroots level, among young people, among older people, among working people, among academics. Let us try to destroy the hatred which exists throughout the world based on fear and ignorance by allowing people to get to know each other. 0.1% would go toward that effort. Now, on a separate note, Mr. President, since March of 2015, the United States Armed Forces have been involved in hostilities between a Saudi-led coalition and the Houthis in Yemen. I believe it is long past time that we put an end to our unconstitutional and unauthorized participation in this war. To my mind, there is no question that U.S. participation in the war in Yemen is unauthorized and is unconstitutional. It is the Congress of the United States that decides whether or not this country goes to war, not the President. The truth about Yemen is that U.S. forces have been actively engaged in support of the Saudi coalition in this war, providing intelligence and aerial refueling of planes whose bombs have killed thousands of people and make the current humanitarian crisis in Yemen the worst humanitarian crisis on the face of the planet today. Even now, as I speak, there are reports that an attack on the Yemeni port city of Hodeidah by the Saudi-led coalition is imminent. Hodeidah is a key entry point for humanitarian aid into Yemen. The UN humanitarian coordinator in the country, Lisa Grand, said last week that, quote, a military attack or siege on Hodeidah will impact hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. In a prolonged worst case, we fear that as many as 250,000 people may lose everything, even their lives, end of quote. The Trump administration has tried to justify our involvement in the Yemen war as necessary to push back on Iran. Well, another administration told us invading Iraq was necessary to confront al-Qaeda, and another told us that the Vietnam War was necessary to contain communism. None of that turned out to be true. Mr. President, I believe that we have become far too comfortable with the United States engaging in military interventions all over the world. We have now been in Afghanistan for 17 years, the longest war in American history. We have been in Iraq for 15 years. Our troops are now in Syria under what I believe are questionable authorities, and the administration has indicated that it may broaden that mission even more. The time is long overdue for the U.S. Congress to reassert its constitutional responsibility over sending our men and women into war. It is the Congress that makes that decision. Couldn't be clearer in the Constitution, not the President of the United States. And that is why I have filed a bipartisan amendment, along with Senators Lee, Murphy, Warren, and several others, that will put an end to the U.S. involvement of the war in Yemen. Mr. President, let me conclude by saying this. I think everybody in the Congress believes and understands that we need a strong defense. No debate about that. But we do not need a defense budget that is bloated, that is wasteful, and that has in it many areas of fraud. I hope all of my colleagues remember, and let me remind some of my Republican colleagues, hard to believe, but Dwight D. Eisenhower, who led American troops in World War II, was a Republican. He was a Republican. And this is what he said as he was leaving office, which is true today as it was when he said that. That was in 1960. He said, and I quote, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron." That is what Dwight D. Eisenhower said way back when, and those are words that I think we should remember today. Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I would yield the floor.